So, thank you very much, Mike, Batty, to have you here today. We would have loved you to have you physical, but we are very much aware of the pandemic and the corona circumstances. So we are very, very happy to have you virtual here today with us. In general, I think, Mike, as the world leader in urban modeling, there is no need for you to introduce you to this elective crowd, but still, let me highlight a few of your publications, which I think everybody in the audience is very much aware of it. So you've already been working very early on the cities and complexity question, you know, the famous book in 2005, the new science of cities 2013, inventing future cities 2018, or the recently published book also with colleagues, Urban Informatics, which also fits superbly well with the content of our first Nobel X Conference. And actually, Springer kindly sent us a few hard copies, so all our dear colleagues here will find the Urban Informatic books in their rucksacks, in their goodie bag. Yes, so Mike will talk today about digital twins. I think a very interesting and novel modeling approach, which is under development. And Mike, may I give you the floor for your talk? Thank you very much for being here today.
Okay, thanks very much, Claudia. I'm sorry I can't be here in person, but many of you have been to Britain before the pandemic, and you know that negotiating Heathrow Airport is a complete nightmare. So, and it's even worse now, in fact, during the pandemic. So for a whole range of reasons, also including spending most of my day in Zoom meetings and so on, which our administration keep fixing up, then apologies for not being there. But at least I will attend insofar as I can the next couple of days and so on. Okay, digital twins and ecology of model applications. Let me tell you what I'm going to talk about in terms of the material. Let me get my PowerPoint. Whoops. Okay, we're off. Let me tell you what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about, at least begin by making a few points about many models of the same phenomenon. This is a relatively new dimension to modeling of all kinds in all fields, in the sense that many of our computer models in the early days of computing were really single models of a particular phenomenon. The fact that we can now build many models of the same phenomenon, many different computer models basically, is largely due to advances in computing and advances in data. Many of you are familiar with what all of those are. So I'll talk about many models of the same phenomena. And that leads me on to this notion of digital twins. What are they and where do they come from? And the key issue in digital twins is how close they are to the real thing in some sense. There are some quite strict definitions of what a digital twin is. They're so strict, in fact, that they really define away the idea of a digital twin. You can't really have a twin which is different from the real thing in some sense. And of course, one of the key things about the digital twin is it must be very close to the real thing. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm then going to launch into a digression for a couple of minutes, well, maybe for 5 minutes or so, talking about a cornucopia of twins. And I want to talk about maps as analogies and relate the fact to the idea that the map basically, in some sense, is an excellent example of how one can build different digital twins. Then what I want to do is to, and I'm very conscious of time here, I'm going to talk about four very different types of digital twin of the same place. And that place is East London at Stratford. That's the Olympic Park, the 2012 Olympic Park, basically. There's a lot going on there, massive amount of regeneration and new development. And we're building four very different models of the same place. We're building our VR and AR models, our 3D city models pertain to East London. We've got some BIM models, basically, in automated building control. We've got our real-time simulation, passenger demand and supply, basically, with respect to movement on public transport, in particular the tube. And we've got a long-term model of urban change, in fact, called the Quant model, which in fact covers the whole of Britain. But of course, all of these models do focus, if we focus down, on this one place. And the big issue is, how do we think about planning in the context of integrating these models. And that leads to the notion that is the concept of the digital twin useful in this particular way. So computing has changed massively the nature of how we theorize and model the physical as well as the social world in that context. And the notion that we can now build more than one model is very much on the cards. It's been anticipated for many years. Counter-modeling was proposed by Greenberger, Crenson and Crissy in a book on public policy and modeling at the Russell Sage Foundation in the 1970s, I think. Yeah, probably the 1970s. And Scott Page has talked about in his book, The Model Thinker. Dirk Helbing has talked about pluralism and modeling and so on. Many people have talked about the idea now of the idea that we can build different models of the same thing in this particular context, and we can build models of different places in some senses, the same model of different places in that sense. So there's been an explosion of ideas related to modeling. So the big question then is, if we have more than one model and all are plausible in some sense, how do we use them? How do we integrate them? And how close are they to the real thing? And this is quite an important issue in the sense that in many of the things that we want to do in urban planning, for example, we do need to look at several different perspectives at the same time. How do we deal with multiple models? And in a sense, if we do have multiple models, we have multiple theories in some sense behind them. And this is a philosophic question to some extent. It's a question about thinking about how we actually put together ideas in terms of thinking about an inquiry into a particular place. And all of this is set against a general background that I take as given, really, that we can't predict the future. We can invent it, but we can't predict what we invent in some sense. And that's another idea for a different talk, really, that has gained momentum in the last few years. So digital twins, what are they and where do they come from? Okay, so we know that models, of course, are abstractions and simplifications of the real thing. And if we can have many models, then we can have many twins in some sense. And this is weird. So a digital twin is a model, or is it? Basically, this is the sort of $64,000 question, really, in some sense. Now, in any model, we throw away most of what is related to the real world. We keep the essence in that sense, and that really is that the model is the simplest that we can actually develop in some sense. And as we move from long-term to short-term and from low-frequency cities to high-frequency, our models begin to change, and perhaps some of them are getting closer to the real thing. Most of the models that we'll talk about in this meeting, I think, most of the models we've ever talked about are not close to the real thing because they are abstractions and simplifications. Now, here's an excellent example, I think, of a digital twin. All the concepts are contained in this. Now, this is a picture taken from Gordon Pask. He was a guy who worked in cybernetics, quite a well-known guy in the 1950s. And his little book, An Approach to Cybernetics, in 1961 contains this picture. And in the picture, we have the real system, which is contained in these little boxes, basically, in the little buildings, I should say. And this is a traffic system. So think of it as a transportation system in some sense. We have a group of people looking at this. So they have a model of it. And in some sense, the model of the system is contained in all the wires that come out of the real system itself, all the information in that sense, which is shown on the control panel or the screen. And in this sense, the digital twin is indeed the control panel. Now, in this particular context, of course, one of the kind of key things is the digital twin is connected to the real system. And that's very important because the strict definition of the digital twin is that it is close and it shares information both ways with the real system itself. And most of our models tend not to do this, although as soon as we build a human into the loop in this sense, then this indeed is the way that we think about the use of the model in that context. So let me extract from that. We have the real system, the traffic system in terms of this diagram. We have the digital twin, which is the model, for want of a better word. We have a circularity between taking data from the real system and feeding data back in this sense. So this is the closeness in a sense. And of course, all of this has the human in the loop in this particular context. And of course, in the world of multiple modeling, we can have multiple digital twins in this sense. As soon as we get into the idea of more than one model, more than one digital twin, then we begin to get problems of semantics in a sense, and of representation. What are two digital twins? Are we talking about digital triplets in this sense, quadruplets and so on and so forth? And indeed, how close is the twin to the real system? That's really the $64,000 question. Once we've got all of this sort of thinking, basically, then how do we integrate them? How do we integrate many different digital twins, many different models in that sense? Okay, now in a way, if you go back to the beginnings of computing, in a sense, then in a way, right at the beginning, we were able to get inside the model in some sense. This is a picture of the ENIAC, which was the one of the first digital computers built at the Moore School at the University of Pennsylvania, which John von Neumann used for, you know, the trajectory calculations for in the Manhattan Project, in a sense. And you can actually see somebody inside the machine. There are lots of pictures in this particular context. So that's not a million miles away from Gordon Pass's little diagram in that sense. There's a great quote, in fact, from a new book by Batty, which is called The Man from the Future. Of course, the man from the future was John von Neumann. Batty says, and I'll read this out, "Now we think of the personal computer as one we can carry around with us," said the mathematician Harry Reid, who joined the ENIAC project in 1950. He said the ENIAC was actually one that you kind of lived inside. It was a computer that you actually lived inside. So to some extent, are we moving back to the same thing full circle? So that's a little bit of a digression. So really, the digital twin cannot be a mirror image of the real system. Otherwise, it would be the system in this particular context. So it can't really be the same as the original, or can it? Or how close can we actually get? So let me make a few issues about modeling and how, to some extent, this throws doubt on the whole idea of the twin. First of all, models depend on the media. If the media is close to the original thing, if it's digital in that sense, and it may well be that we're modeling a production process, which is automated and it's digital in that sense. If we have another digital model in a sense, then we can sort of see that to some extent the model depends on the media in that sense. So if the original system is digital and we're building a twin of it in this sense, another digital version which may be different in some senses, then you can see this as being close in some sense to the real thing. The second issue is, can the digital twin be used for predicting a future that doesn't exist, in a sense? If it's close to the real thing, then the real thing exists now. And in a sense, models are used to actually think about informing the future in this sense. So can the digital twin have a role in terms of computing the future, in a sense, or predicting the future? A digital twin is reactive rather than predictive. That's really, to some extent, summarizing what I've just said. And a digital twin is a coupling, a relationship between the original and the digital. It involves the transfer of information. The little picture from Gordon Pask, etc., and the block diagram, and indeed the picture of the man inside the ENIAC computer, these all involve transfers of information. And this is not necessarily so for the more abstract models that we build, or is it? Because to some extent, we do enter the loop. We're the motivator in some sense of all of this. So the fourth point, in fact, is the digital twin might be used as a controller in some sense of the system in that sense, if it links to the system in this particular way. So where do digital twins come from? Well, the idea appears to have been coined in the early 2000s by a chap called Michael Greaves, who has worked in production engineering at Michigan, I think, University of Michigan, although it's not really until a little bit later, as a paper by him in 2014, that the idea, became popular in that sense. And you can see his kind of digital twin as being close to the real thing itself. So you have an automated production system, which might be a CAD/CAM system in some sense. And this, in fact, can be modeled in some way. And the best example I think we have in our world is the idea of a building information system model, a BIM in this particular context. And it's well known now that if you're building, certainly if you're developing a complex building, then of course you have a process whereby you put together the materials, etc., of the building and so on. You build a model in some sense of the building before you build it. The model might really relate to a whole range of things that pertain to the construction of the building. Once the building is finished, then the software still remains in place so that the building can be maintained. And in that sense, the software is in part and parcel of the fabric of the building in that sense. So to some extent, a digital twin is really part and parcel of the real system in this context. And as I said, the best example is a BIM. I'll show you an example of that in a moment in some sense. Okay, now let me have a quick look at time. 10:21 or 11:21 for you. I think we're okay for time. I'm sure Claudia will remind me when I'm getting a bit closer towards the end. Okay, so let's digress and talk about a cornucopia of twins. I want to say, look at a couple of interesting analogies in terms of maps as analogies in this particular context. Now we know that the whole idea of thinking about a map, the idea of thinking about a map in this particular context is very evocative of a whole range of things. So, for example, Mandelbrot's "How Long is the Coast of Britain?" His science paper in 1967. Of course, the answer is the length of the coastline is infinite, but the real answer is it depends. It depends on the scale. And in some sense, this throws ideas of digital twins and maps into some perspective. Now, the best digital twin story I've ever come across is the one in Lewis Carroll's book, Sylvia and Bruno Concluded, published in 1893. Lewis Carroll, of course, was the author of Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass. He tells of a conversation between himself and a German gentleman about making a map close to the thing. Now, let me read this out. I'm going to read it out. It's a conversation between me, okay, and Mein who's this German gentleman who's talking about the map. Now, unfortunately, I can speak with a Liverpool accent, but I can't speak with a German accent. So you're going to have to take it in that sense. So I say, what a useful thing a pocket map is, I remarked. Mein Herr, that's another thing we've learned from your nation, said Mein Herr, map making, but we've carried it much further than you. What do you consider the largest map that would be really useful? Me, about 6 inches to the mile. Mein Herr, only 6 inches, exclaimed Mein Herr. We very soon got to 6 yards to the mile, then 100 yards to the mile, and then came the greatest idea of all. We actually made a map of the country on the scale of a mile to a mile. Myself, have you used it much, I inquired. Mein Herr, it has never been spread out yet, said Mein Herr. The farmers objected. They said it would cover the whole country and shut out the sunlight. So now we use the country itself as its own map. And I assure you, it does nearly as well in that sense. Now, this notion that the map is the model in some sense, and the map is close to the country in that sense, the map is the digital twin in a sense, has been talked about by many people since Carroll wrote his novel back in the late 19th century. For example, Borges has talked about it. I'll look at the example in a moment. Gregory Bates and Joan Robinson, the economist, talked about digital twins in this sense, maps. Baudrillard, David Galenta in his Mirror World book. E.H. Lawrence said in one of his novels that the map appears to be more real than the land in this particular context. So Borges says it has a great essay in 1946 on exactitude in science. And he tells the story of cartographers so obsessed with their art that they decided to produce the most detailed map of their empire, the scale of 1 to 1. And he concludes it by saying that the next generation no longer were interested in the map in that sense. And he concludes it by saying that in the deserts of the West still today, there are tattered ruins of that map. Now, this is a real digression. If you've seen the movie The English Patient, there's a picture of Ralph Fiennes there, clutching his map, as it were, which indeed is the Herodotus, the histories in that sense. This is this last point made by Borges called in the deserts of the West still there are tattered ruins of the map. Watch the movie or read the book basically, and you get a real sense in that sense of of the idea of the map in this particular way. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't say that somewhat independently of these origins, my friend and late colleague Lionel March used this example from Carroll in his paper to the in 1974 Urban Development Models Conference in Churchill College, Cambridge. I'm not sure you were there, Peter, Peter Nijkamp, and I'm not sure anybody else was there, but Michael Wegener, I think, was probably there back then. But anyway, let me summarize what he says in this thing. I'm just going to blow up the last paragraph and read it out to you. Maps like, this is from Lionel March, maps like models are made at appropriate levels of detail for different purposes. An exact replica of the world would be no more use than the captain's map in another work by Carroll, The Hunt of the Snark. The map was a perfect and absolute blank. All models to be useful must be selective, and if you like, false to the reality in some respect or other, pocket models may be the most useful thing in the end. This is Lionel speaking in that sense. Okay, so that's very much my digression. Let me move on to the different examples in some sense that I've got. Now, I've got 4 different examples of models that are being built on the same place being the Olympic Park. 3D cities using physical representation of the elements that define the buildings in the city, but also embedding into those models notions about what's happening in real time in the city, etc. You'll see in a moment that manipulating these models is slightly problematic because we have different timescales that are being featured in terms of these realities. Then the smart buildings, the BIM model, what I call the high frequency city, which is really what's happening over the next 5 minutes or 5 hours, rather than the next 5 years. Flows of traffic, which relate to a problem in demand and supply. That's very resonant with East London, as we'll see in this particular context, largely because the Crossrail, the high-speed line in London, connects Stratford to East London to other parts of the capital, east-west. And lastly, our LUTI model, land use transportation interaction model, QUANT, which is a model of the low frequency city, but again, relating to the same place. In fact, all of these models at one level, if we embed the scales, put the different scales on top of one another, at the point where they join, which is East London, then of course the different scales are included in the different maps in that sense. Okay, let's begin with our 3D London model in this sense. So if you ask people about models of cities, basically, then they often begin to think in these terms. This is a paper written by Andy Hudson Smith and myself from Architectural Design in 2005. And the models go back a long way in this sense. So this is our model from back in 2005. In that sense, you can actually see it. That's the non-rendered block model, basically. And you can see the wireframe in the bottom right-hand corner. We use this model not because we're interested particularly in rendering the buildings. There's only about 50 buildings rendered in detail. That's Cannon Street. And you can see as we cross the Thames there onto the South Bank, these are the blocks. We're interested in populating the blocks. Our interest in CASA has always been with these 3D models as really moving GIS into the third dimension in this context. Parliament is, we've just passed there, is rendered in a bit more detail, the tower, and the Millennium Wheel was rendered in great detail by Andy himself, basically, I think, in that sense. But you get the idea of these models. Now, in the top right-hand corner of this slide, were I to click on it, I would launch a Vimeo, I think, movie, and it would give me the first wireframe models ever, which were built in the early 1980s by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill in that sense. Now, I'm not going to click on it because once when I clicked on it using Google Meet in a conference of this kind, I lost the audience, and it took me about half an hour to realize that I'd lost the audience by loading this Vimeo, basically. So loading web-based things from within web-based things is quite problematic in some sense. Okay, let me move on in this context. And this is what we've done. This is what Andy's done more recently. This is our 3D London model, actually located somewhere in East London, I think, looking in that direction towards the city, I guess. basically. So you can see the model inside the picture in this way. Let me just move on to pictures of these models, basically. So what Andy is doing here is very much abstracting from the 3D model itself, but it's very much 3D. You can fly around it, and contained within it are a whole variety of media. So when you run the model, in some sense, you're also linking to real-time flows, basically. And you can see this is a particularly good version of it. It looks like a kind of, looks like one of these children's constructor sets, basically, in that sense. And to some extent it is. It's putting in these different media and beginning to experiment with it. It's highly experimental in that sense, but it's close to the real thing, at least in one sense. Okay, in the same place, let me just go back. I can't quite focus it. You can see the Olympic Stadium in the middle of the picture, just to the slightly to the left, basically. You can see the stadium there. That's where West Ham play now. That's the Hammers football ground, basically. And there's a whole variety of stuff floating around there, the Westfield Shopping Centre. And then a little bit to the north, basically, on the edge of the map here, north of the stadium, in a sense, we've actually got the Here East building. And that's the building that used to be the media center for the Olympic Games. And it's now owned, I think, by UCL, or it's in some common university ownership. And it's being wired in some sense after the event. So what we're doing in our group, at least in the Connected Environments group of CASA, they're actually putting in sensors, and after the fact, because there was no BIM built when the original building was built, back 10 or 12 years or so ago, in that sense. So this shows you the building itself, and then what they've done is to install these various sensors and then build a whole variety of software. The sensors basically sense movement, energy, heat, and various sort of things in the building, basically, and they have a 3D model which is running alongside this. So this is all happening in real time. So it's a classic BIM in this particular context, after the fact, used to some extent to control. Well, actually, it's not used to control the building. It's really used to monitor the building, because to control the building, the stuff would have had to be built into the fabric in the first instance. But it's the closest thing, I think, to what we have as a digital twin. Okay, and these are pictures, basically, and you can see on the right there the actual kind of graph of, don't quite know what it is, it's probably temperature of some sort in a particular place. So that's the kind of context that relates to these bins. Let me talk about my third example, which again really relates to real-time movement in the city, more to do with the high frequency city than the low frequency. This is our Oyster Card project, our project that really relates to modeling, or representing, really, in a sense, the movement of traffic on the public transport network, which is taken from two sources. One, the demand by travelers for travel. And of course, we use the Oyster Card, or people now basically have this stuff on their phones, of course. And you can see the sensing of that data, basically. The data is the tap in, tap out data. And the model we built is made of tube. Buses, of course, take all of this, but you can only tap in on a bus in London. You don't tap out, for a whole range of reasons relating to, you know, the ability of the driver, the one-man buses, basically, to validate, in a sense, a fee passenger. So in some sense, the model we're building is of the tube network, and that's the demand by travelers. Of course, the data is purely for payment. It's not really for us, in some sense, to think about travel patterns and so on. London Transport, or Transport for London rather, really are only just beginning to use this data. They've got about nearly 20 years of it now, because it started in 2003, this automated system. They've got about 20 years of it, but they've not used it really to look at demand so far. They're beginning to think about it. We do have data on the supply of trains, basically, which is a different automated system, basically. And what we're really interested in is tying up demand and supply in that sense. That, in other words, if you tap in and you get onto a train, we want to know what train you've got onto in that sense. And that's a non-trivial matter because, you know, if you go into a complex tube station like Oxford Circus or somewhere, or King's Cross, and you've never been in there before, it might take you a hell of a lot longer to get to your train than it would take somebody like myself who knows it like the back of my hand, really, in a sense, and isn't able to go. So to some extent, we want to connect up demand and supply. We can't do that because there's all sorts of issues pertaining to confidentiality, tracking, tracing, and photography and so on in the tube that stop us linking a particular traveller to a particular train, although Transport for London are working on it in some sense. So that's the actual network which these cards work on. The tube is embedded in this in some sense. So that's the tube network. And what you can see from this, I've shown this before, I just clicked it on. And if you look at the little counter at the top right, we're on Monday at the moment, so we're just switching over Tuesday. Now the Tuesday morning peak has come up, and then the evening peak, and then at the end of the day there's a little blick at that point, and that's the late evening peak in the city, in the West End, and so on. And so this is a week's worth of synthesized data. In that sense, it's a great map because, you know, it's sort of, you know, the whole notion about cities and complexity and the organic analogy is contained writ large in a map like this. So it's really the distribution of energy, although it's just people on the tube. Okay, so that's actually stopped at that point. Let me, there's a picture of John Reeds, who worked on the project originally. And these are pictures. There's a Vimeo movie about it in that sense. Here's the supply of train stuff. And that shows you the supply of trains. Let me just show you this one. So that's the supply of trains from TrackerNet, basically. It's a very poor system compared to the Oyster card system, basically. You can see the different tube lines, and you can also see that some of the trains have fallen off the track. Okay, it was much speeded up for the whole day, but trains have fallen off the track. And that's because of noise in the TrackerNet system. It reset itself at the beginning of this simulation of this representation. Trains have fallen off the track. I said to Richard Milton, or one of our programmers, that can you get the trains back on the track? He said, Mike, he said, you know as well as I do that this is a big data set. I could get the trains back on the track if you gave me 1,000 years to do it. I could pick up individually and place them on the track. But as all of this stuff is streamed in real time, and it's a 3-minute latency from the point where the trains produce this data, and he's recording it all the time somewhere in Casa, basically, then this is real-time stuff that you really can't interfere with. You know, if it goes wrong, that's it, basically, in terms of the data. Okay, now, of course, there's a whole variety of things here. I wanted to show this picture because this brings me back to the beginning of computing. In fact, computers were barely developed at this particular point. This is 4 months before World War II broke out, and this is ladies working for London Transport counting tickets to build up an origin and destination survey in the pre-computing age, 1939. I guess Konrad Zuse in Germany and Atanasoff in Iowa and so on, they built the early digital computers at that particular point, but only just, basically. So this is the non-automated world, but it's big data in that sense. That's another talk. Okay, now how are we doing for time? I'm about
3 more minutes, Mike, please.
3 more minutes. Very good.
We have time for some questions. Thank you.
Yeah, this is my last example. Okay, now we're building a model of the UK. Which is a land use transportation model. We've actually had it built for 5 years or so. And the reason why we're building it is because of big infrastructure projects. The railways were built between 1830 and 1870, and nothing much has been done on them since. So they're having to be renewed. And the High Speed 2, which is the line from London to Manchester by Birmingham and so on, very controversial. Things like Crossrail across London, Crossrail 1, and Crossrail 2, which is north-south, East-West Rail to Oxford and Cambridge, the Northern Powerhouse Rail, Northern Rail basically, Manchester to Leeds, lots of new lines being proposed in this context, as well as developments in the motorway system. Whether or not we'll ever build a third runway at Heathrow, I don't know now in that sense, but lots of issues pertaining to levelling up of Britain, in a sense, north-south divide and so on. And so consequently, our models are scaled to the UK. And but what we're interested in here is this model, of course, that we've got is also located it does cover Stratford and East London in this particular context. So these are some of our models. That's the Stratford site. Basically, that's London and the Outer Met area. So let me just go through the desktop version of the model. Quickly go through here, and the model is a bunch of web services, really. At least Richard, who's our key man on this, the architect, thinks of programming as web services these days. So this is the server side. This is a model that runs on the web. Basically, you can actually, this is a picture of what it is on the web. You can log on, and you can even run it on your phone, basically. And it has a big model of the UK, 8,500 zones, England, Scotland, and Wales. And there's 70 million potential trips in the spatial interaction. It's modal and so on. Richard spent a lot of time, improving it to the point where it runs in about 30 seconds, basically. Because if you're sitting you're a planner in practice, basically, it's open source. It's not open source. It's free at the point of use, I should say. It's a model that basically you don't want to wait 10 minutes for the results. Basically, you need to have it fast, basically. So these are pictures. That's the web link, Quantcasa, so on. And this is the kind of thing you can do in the model. Okay, now we're interested in particular in Crossrail. Crossrail, and you can see on the bottom left, basically, the location of the Olympic site. And you can also see the Crossrail in diagram B here in that sense. And of course, Crossrail has an enormous impact on the Olympic Games area in some sense, because it's bringing new people in. And already predictions have been made of new employment and so on over the last 10 or 15 years. And you can actually see the focusing down on in diagram D at the end here, in the green maps, basically, you can see that we're focusing down here. Now, the big question, of course, is how do we integrate all of this stuff? I don't have, well, there's lots of conditional answers in a sense, but I don't have a perfect answer to how one does this, basically, in some sense. It's left to the human in the loop as to how all this stuff is really integrated. So let me just finish 30 seconds, Claudia. Is the concept of the digital twin useful? I'm going to leave you to judge that in some senses, but there are lots of issues pertaining to the language and the ambiguity and so on. Federated digital twins have come onto the agenda, many twins, triplets, and so on. So that's one issue. It forces us to think about what smart cities really are, which of course is part of the debate about what cities are and how they're being transformed by new technologies, many implications there. And last but not least, it forces us to think about what a model really is and how we can link many models together and how we can think of many models as being mirrors of different theories or conceptions of the system at the same time in some sense. So thanks very much. I've written 3 editorials in Environment Planning B on this, and there is a paper coming out in a book called Digital Twins for Smart Cities